Good morning and welcome. My name is Reverend Kate Wilkinson, and I am so glad that you are here with us this morning. I feel like I have already worshiped this morning on my drive in from Wellfleet, passing the Pan Mass Challenge. And here is what I learned at church this morning. I learned to pay attention. I learned patience. I learned how we can encourage one another on our journey. I learned that from the crowds lining the path for the bikers. I learned that we can depend on the kindness of strangers. I saw an injured rider around the vineyard, and so many bikers stopped to help him, and it was really powerful to watch. I think I also learned a little bit about the power of prayer, because every car that drove by said a little prayer for that rider. And I hope that he's made his way to the hospital and is doing okay. It looked like he was headed in that direction. And I also learned about hope, because that whole ride is about finding cures for cancer and ending suffering. So thank you to Ave and all the other riders this morning. She's made it in? All right. A hand for the riders. Each Sunday we light our chalice as a symbol of our faith, and this morning we invite Ryan to light our chalice for us. Please join me in a spirit of meditation and prayer. After our spoken prayer and a time of silence, we will sing together hymn number 123, Spirit of Life. We'll sing it first in English and then in Spanish. This morning's prayer is by Gary Kowalski. Maybe prayer doesn't mean talking to God at all. Maybe it means just listening, unplugging the TV, turning off the computer, quieting the mental chatter and distractions. Maybe it means listening to the birds and the insects, the wind in the leaves, the creaking and groaning of the trees, noticing who else is out there, not far away but nearby, sitting so still we can hear our heartbeat, watch our breath, the gentle whoosh of air, the funny noises from our own insides, marveling at the body we take so much for granted. Maybe it means listening to our dreams, paying more attention to what we really want from life, and less attention to all the nagging, scolding voices from our past. Or maybe it's all about listening to each other, not thinking ahead to how we can answer or rebut or parry or advise or admonish, but actually being present to each other. Perhaps if we just sit quietly, we'll overhear a peace whispering through the centuries that's missing from the clamor of the moment. Maybe prayer means listening to the silences between the words, noticing the negativity of space, the vast, undifferentiated, and nameless wonder that underlies it all. Maybe prayer doesn't mean talking to God at all, but listening with the heart to the angel choirs all around us. Those who have ears, let them hear. Amen. This morning's reading is by one of my favorite poets, and I invite Allison Mickelson to share our reading with us this morning.
The Chairs That No One Sits In by Billy Collins. You see them on porches and on lawns down by the lakeside, usually arranged in pairs, implying a couple who might sit there and look out at the water or big shade trees. The trouble is, you never see anyone sitting in these forlorn chairs, though at one time it must have seemed a good place to stop and do nothing for a while. Sometimes there's a little table between the chairs where no one is resting a glass or placing a book face down. It might be none of my business, but it might be a good idea one day for everyone who placed those vacant chairs on a veranda or a dock to sit down in them for the sake of remembering whatever it was they thought deserved to be viewed from two chairs side by side with a table in between. The clouds are high and massive that day. The woman looks up from her book. The man takes a sip of his drink. Then there is nothing but the sound of their looking, the lapping of lake water, and the call of one bird, then another, cries of joy or warning. It passes the time to wonder which.
Thank you. In a recent New York Times article entitled "The End of Reflection," Teddy Wayne writes, Teddy Wayne writes, this is like, okay. Teddy Wayne, it's annoying, isn't it? In a recent New York Times article entitled "The End of Reflection," Teddy Wayne writes, "There are many moments throughout my average day that in a previous era were once occupied by thinking or observing my surroundings, walking or waiting somewhere, riding the subway, lying in bed, unable to sleep, or not able to muster the energy to get up. Now, though," he says, "I often find myself in these situations picking up my phone to check a notification, browse or read the internet, text, use an app or listen to audio, or on rare occasions engage in an old-fashioned telephone call." A study recently released by Deloitte found that Americans collectively check their smartphones upwards of 8 billion times per day. Although 46 checks per day is the average, that number varies depending on the user's age group. Those between ages of 18 and 24 look at their phones most often, an average of 74 times a day. So taking out time for sleeping, that's about every 10 minutes. The survey found that most people check their phones while doing errands, watching television, and during leisure time. However, Deloitte also found that 81% of Americans spend time looking at their phones while dining out in restaurants. My partner Lisa can attest to this. She is working at 2 restaurants this summer, and she reports that phone usage at the table is at an all-time high. Sometimes she can barely get people to give their order. I find this sad on a number of levels. It's sad that we have no attention span anymore. It's sad that we don't enjoy each other's company enough to be present with one another. It's sad that people are just plain rude. But after reading the New York Times article that I mentioned earlier, I also find it sad in a new way. Constant attention to our phones and other distractions that we indulge ourselves in may just be coming at the cost of reflection. You remember reflection, don't you? Thoughtful consideration of a subject for longer than 2 seconds? The mulling of ideas? Free association of thoughts? New ideas and inspiration arising from a wandering mind? The surprising firing up of synapses as you realize that two ideas are connected? The gradual deepening of thought, which allows you to change your mind, understand another point of view, or see something in a new way. You remember reflection, the dodo bird of the modern age. It's that thing we used to do while we were walking, waiting, riding on the subway, having trouble sleeping. Before we insisted on being stimulated during every waking moment, preferably by two things at once. Finding moments to engage in contemplative thinking has always been a challenge because we're distractible, says Nicholas Carr, author of The Shallows. But now that we're carrying these powerful media devices around with us all day long, those opportunities become even less frequent, for the simple reason that we have the ability to distract ourselves constantly. The last remaining place I'm guaranteed to be alone with my thoughts, Wayne says, is in the shower. Thank goodness for bathing. I'm sure these will be waterproof soon. Take them in there. Another interesting thing about that study that I was telling you about how often we use our phones, is that when they measure not only how often we check our phone, but also ask participants in the study how often they think they have used their phones, there's a huge gap. We check our phones and other electronic devices twice as often as we think we do. So what is this doing to our attention spans? In 2006, Forrester Research found that online shoppers expected web pages to load in about 4 seconds. 3 years later, the number was shaved to 2 seconds. Slower web pages led shoppers to look elsewhere. By 2012, Google engineers had discovered that when results take longer than 2/5 of a second to appear, people give up and head to another website. In his book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain, Carr writes, "This all hints at the way that as our technologies increase the intensity of stimulation and the flow of new things, we adapt to that pace. We become less patient. When moments without stimulation arise, we start to feel panicked and don't know what to do with them because we've trained ourselves to expect this stimulation, new notifications and alerts, all the time." Carr worries about the loss of the contemplative mind. We've adopted the Google ideal of the mind, he says, which is that you have a question that you can answer quickly. Close-ended, well-defined questions. Lost in that conception is that there's also this open-ended way of thinking where you're not always trying to answer a question. You're trying to go where that thought leads you. As a society, we're saying that that way of thinking isn't important anymore. It's viewed as inefficient. The illustration on the New York Times article, The End of Reflection, says it all. It's a drawing of the Rodin sculpture, The Thinker. You know the one. He's leaning on his fists in a thoughtful way. Except in this version, in his other hand, he's holding an iPhone. Mr. Carr observed that for decades, Rodin's 1902 sculpture, The Thinker, epitomized the highest form of contemplation. A figure with an imposing physique, staring abstractly downward, hunched over to block out distractions, frozen, well, because it's a statue, but also because deep thinkers need time. It's hard to imagine a postmodern update called The Tweeter being quite so inspirational. The thing is, giving the mind a break, taking some R&R, letting our mind wander, it's not just an indulgence. It's actually a necessary part of how our brain works, especially if we want to be productive, creative, and generative the rest of the time. Research clearly shows that giving our brains a break now and then by spending time in the outdoors, meditating, unwinding at the end of a day, taking vacation, taking a nap, or even just the act of blinking, all these things actually sharpen our minds. You see, when we are relaxing or daydreaming, the brain doesn't really slow down or stop working. Instead, it engages in a dazzling array of molecular, genetic, and physiological processes, similar to what happens when we sleep at night. Brain scans clearly show that during rest, different neural circuits become active, summoning extra blood full of oxygen and glucose to use as energy. Researchers used an fMRI scanner to study the brain while someone was lying down, letting their thoughts wander, and then again when they were concentrating on a mental challenge. And there are several regions of the brain that consistently become less active during heavy thinking, but fire away when the daydreaming starts. It's during this so-called downtime that we replenish stores of attention and motivation, increase productivity and creativity, and solidify our everyday memories. A wandering mind unsticks us in time so that we can learn from the past and plan for the future. Moments of respite may even be necessary to keep one's moral compass in working order and to maintain a sense of self. Downtime and reflection are actually integral for becoming who we are. Think about it. It's when our mind wanders that we replay conversations that we had earlier in the day, rewriting our verbal blunders as a way of learning to avoid them in the future. We craft fictional dialogue to practice standing up to someone who intimidates us, or to reap the satisfaction of an imaginary harangue against someone who wronged us. We shuffle through all those neglected mental post-it notes listing half-finished projects, and we mull over aspects of our lives with which we are most dissatisfied, searching for solutions. We sink into scenes from childhood and catapult ourselves into different hypothetical futures. We subject ourselves to a kind of moral performance review, questioning how we have treated others lately. These moments of introspection are the way we form a sense of self, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. In a Scientific American article, Why Your Brain Needs More Downtime, Faris Jabbar writes, "When it has a moment to itself, the mind dips its quill into our memories, sensory experiences, disappointments, and desires, so that it may continue writing this ongoing first-person narrative called life." I remember when I was little complaining to my parents that I was bored. Now, this was back in the day before all our childhood time was scheduled time, before the invention of helicopter parenting. Instead, we had endless time in the backyard and the woods and making up our own games. And occasionally, I would complain, "I'm so bored." And my dad would always say, "I don't know what that word means." Well, it turns out that boredom is actually a very useful and necessary thing. In his paper, Doing Nothing and Nothing to Do, The Hidden Value of Empty Time, Manfred Ketz-de-Vries writes, "While most of us find it hard to tolerate, in many instances boredom is a prelude to something." Boredom is a prelude to something. It can trigger our imagination and creativity. It can be a critical resource that pushes us to seek the unfamiliar. There are many well-known examples of brilliant ideas that have come to people out of nowhere, probably while they were bored. Archimedes in his bath, Newton in his garden, and Paul McCartney, who woke up one morning having composed the tune for Yesterday in his sleep. There is an upside to downtime. So here is my challenge for you. Sometime in the next week, I want you to find 2 empty chairs and sit in one of them. Maybe not if they're in your neighbor's yard, depending on how close you are. But take in the view. Let your mind wander. Listen to the wind and the birds and the choirs of angels surrounding you. Do nothing until you are bored, and then keep going. Breathe. Blink. Repeat. Maybe the solution to world peace is waiting for you on the other side of your daydream. Or maybe just an inner peace for yourself. It's worth it either way. Don't let this age of technology be the end of reflection. Instead, let it be a beginning. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.